Welcome back to Heard Tell. Hot topic because he wrote a piece about it over 2 years ago, and it still gets good numbers, and it keeps coming up because it's an issue that keeps evolving and growing, and people just can't seem to get their heads around it, how the Latino communities are growing politically. Our buddy Mark Yzaguirre. See, I knew I was going to blow it. Just say your own.
Yzaguirre. That was close enough. That's good. That's
good. Man, I just got done doing an interview with some folks from West Virginia, so the accent got on strong. And Yzaguirre, Mark Yzaguirre. He writes better than I say. Great guy. How are you, sir? Appreciate your time today.
Good. Thanks for having me on the show.
He's an attorney in the Houston area. We have to disclaim it. That doesn't mean he's your attorney, so you can't get legal advice from him, but he's a good guy, good writer. He wrote in Ordinary Times about the Latino growth in the Rio Grande Valley, Texas, an area he knows well. He wrote that clear back in 2020, but it keeps coming up, Mark, because I don't know that folks can really get their head around the fact that we saw the census data. The Latino population is the fastest growing, but it's growing organically. It's actually not through immigration. It is now through births and the death ratio. Folks just can't get their head around this. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think part of it's been, the assumption has been immigration and the centrality of immigration as far as being both a political issue and the assumption that that the rise is going to be constantly from that. And I think it's something that people have often forgotten that, particularly in Texas. I mean, my family settled in Texas when it was still a Spanish colony. There have been people there who've been there for a real long time, and it's been all natural increase there, for many generations, bolstered by people coming in from Mexico and other parts of Latin America, particularly Mexico, in Texas, particularly. And so that's one aspect that I think, and things that immigration has declined. Also, the birth rate in Mexico has declined dramatically. I mean, a lot of it can be also explained by the fact that in Mexico, I think several generations ago that the birth rate was like 4 or 5, while now it's close to the United States, more like a replacement rate of 2. So people are staying, and so that's feeding it. So now you have people who are here. And then you have the people who've been here for very, very long standing, but then the ones who've been here for a generation or two, they're, it's a politically incorrect term, assimilating, but assimilation in the population, but also, they also come with their own beliefs and their own customs and their own views. And with respect to voting, a lot of it has been more conservative than people have given it credit for. And while they voted for the Democrats, and I'm Democrat, and voted Democrat for years, that the Democratic Party in, say, South Texas is going to be very different than the Democratic Party in Dallas, much less in New York or Chicago, and so you've had a certain conservatism that's always been there that didn't necessarily manifest in voting for the Republicans for a whole lot of reasons, but a lot of those reasons aren't necessarily that different than other than white voters in other southern states.
And you talk about it being more of an organic thing than a political thing. We're talking kind of the old term, I hate to put it this way, but the pre-Trump definition of conservatives. Obviously, historically, a lot of Catholics, very family-centered, family values type issues. But you also talk about just professionally, one of the great lines you had in the piece that keeps getting play on the commentary was, you talk about things with the police issue. Well, in places like the Rio Grande Valley, they are the police now. They are the lower level administrators in local government, in the school boards, in things like this. That's part of that assimilation thing you're talking about. And I don't know that folks realize that maybe their stereotype hasn't caught up to how integral into these communities these folks are now.
Yeah, and I mean, in the case of Rio Grande Valley, I mean, they have always been, or at least for a real long time, been the cops and the business people, and from the small business people to the small shop owner to the very wealthy, and then you have that spreading to the rest of the United States, particularly in Texas, where, I mean, I live in Houston. I mean, the last police chief was Cuban, not Mexican American, but Latino. There's no shortage of Latino cops. There's no shortage of Latino business people, and I would think that's the case as things spread throughout different parts of the country. And to me, it's interesting to see how that will play out as more Latinos vote to areas where there hasn't been a big Latino population, like Arkansas, North Carolina, places like that. But I go back to when you look at voting, I mean, voting tends to follow certain demographics, and policemen tend to be, or law enforcement in general, and by that I'm including the Border Patrol, for example, tend to vote more on the conservative side, wherever they are. Small business people tend to do the same. So they're following a trend that would not be particularly noteworthy if it were among white voters. In Texas, the term is Anglo voters. It's not a pejorative or anything like that. It's just used to differentiate white people who are Latino versus those of Anglo-Saxon descent. But the thing is, it's somewhere no one would be surprised that the policemen or the business people in a small Texas city, it's predominantly Anglo, we're going to be voting conservative, and now that means voting Republican. That wasn't the case for so long. As we all know, the Democratic Party dominated the South for over a century, and that was not a liberal Democratic Party. And that was something where there was a liberal and a conservative faction within the party. And in a lot of ways, the Hispanic vote in South Texas wasn't always necessarily on the liberal side of the party. It would just depend on the issue and depend on the what was salient at that particular day.
We've talked about it before, and it's been all over the national media if you look close enough. The Democratic Party really got obsessed over this demographics as destiny. There's parts of the Republican Party that fall into this on the other spectrum and got into a really dark place with it in a hurry, but we'll leave that for another day. But the problem with when you get into that is you just start lumping these people into a demographic onto an Excel spreadsheet, and you think they're going to act a certain way. But like you said, a Latino in Texas is probably going to be a little different than a Latino in Florida or a Latino that has moved to a northern state. You really start losing the fact that, there's an environmental, and I don't mean the climate, I mean where they live, where they work, the communities they start, grown up in, raise their kids in. Those are factors that don't show up just under the heading Latino, but it greatly affects their politics and their cultural beliefs.
Right. I mean, there's going to be a push and pull based on where you live, and then that's natural. I mean, and for that matter, if it's, say, Latino who's maybe from a more conservative background who goes to a more liberal place, quote unquote, and they're going to be influenced by that just because that's the environment that they're in. And again, that's normal for them. I mean, the idea of like, well, the conservative family, the kid goes off to some liberal college and comes back, kind of spouting out stuff. They're just like stunned and, and by their liberalism. Well, that happens everywhere. And it's not going to be surprising that, why would it be surprising then that people who move to a particular place, if the politics are more conservative, adopt it. And also, I don't think one can underestimate the importance of what I would call transactional politics, political patronage. A lot of people get involved in political activity, not necessarily for terribly ideological reasons. They just want to be involved in the public process. They want to, they want power, if you want to, fit in a more mean way. So they're going to do business with who's there. And if you're in a state where the Republican Party is really dominant, then it would stand to reason a good chunk of people are going to become Republicans just for that reason, if for nothing else, much less actual ideological reasons. And once you're around people and start working with them, it's natural to start in any group to start kind of inculcating the values from that group. So that's why I think in a place like Texas that the move hasn't been, and first the whole demographics is destiny. I mean, that's something that, speaking personally, I mean, years ago I was writing about in other places like Huffington Post saying, don't do this, please don't make this assumption. And part was for the reasons you're talking about, that people change, people act in unpredictable ways, but also just from my own experience, like I used to be a Republican myself, and I knew plenty of Latino Republicans that I was, in places like South Texas in particular, just thinking, you shouldn't make these assumptions. And a lot of times people's partisan makeup is based on local factors. I can even go a little specific. I mean, the South Texas state reps and congressmen, often on social issues, would tend to vote more with Republicans, like in the Texas state legislature, and and they would be strong on issues wanting to on what you might call the social spending, that sort of thing, more traditional liberal. But even then, it's like, is that shocking? I mean, a lot of in the old days, a lot of northeastern, what they used to call the white ethnic Democrats, Polish, Italian, and such in the Northeast were very pro New Deal, very much in favor of more, kind of evolving the economy to help the poor, but they also were socially conservative, and there was a drift there too, and again, if you saw it there, why would you be surprised seeing it elsewhere?
Talking to Mark Yzaguirre. Did I get it right that time?
Yes.
Our buddy Mark Yzaguirre is talking Latinos, some writing he has done. When we come back on Heard Tell, we're going to dig into it a little bit deeper. Going to talk about a wonderful term he used called Rancho Libertarianism. Going to talk about what that is. Also talk broader spectrum, what it means when we try to just lump people into people groups. More with him right after this on Heard Tell. Welcome back to Heard Tell. Our buddy Mark Yzaguirre, who is a name grenade for me to have to get my hillbilly tongue wrapped around, but we're working really hard on it, my friend. You had a wonderful thing in your piece. I love this term, and then once you extrapolated it out, I liked it even more. Rancho Libertarianism. Explain to us what Rancho Libertarianism is.
Rancho Libertarianism, that's a great term created by a California writer, Gustavo Arellano, who is a great person to follow on Twitter, in media in general. He writes, I believe, for the LA Times. And it was a term that he came up with to talk about and the sort of conservatism that you see among Hispanics, and he was talking more about California, and maybe California rural Hispanics, maybe kind of in Inland Empire and places like that. But but it's certainly valid in Texas, and in fact, probably even more so. And there, I mean, it's libertarianism, not in a sort of either Ayn Rand sense or in a really theoretical kind of Cato Institute sense. It's more of just a leave me alone sort of worldview. And it's basically just like, it's this idea of like being very, kind of fiercely independent. Often people who are maybe small landowners, have their own small ranches, or they're, small business people. And, and it's Latino, so I mean, you also have all the things that go that, whether it's, religion, more Catholicism than not. Although there too, one thing that's interesting there is the extent to which a lot of Hispanics have been converting to various Protestant denominations, and that's really a lot of those tend to be like Latino evangelicals tend to definitely be more conservative than a lot of Latino Catholics even, and just this idea, but also this like kind of a tie into while they're happy to be in the United States and fiercely patriotic, they also have warm views towards Mexico, and that's the largest of the countries that they came from, and whether it's manifesting in food and music and just sort of like a certain type of there is a certain kind of sense of humor. It's kind of hard to really describe, that basically that when you're in a place like South Texas, you just kind of get. And that sense of humor is, I mean, you could say is how it plays into mainstream American culture. It's not one that's, it's definitely one that can, frankly, listen to a guy like Joe Rogan and laugh and, and be, yeah, I like that guy, and me gusta, and they're not, and they're not one for for being overly offended by things, and so that really plays into it. It's just a sort of cultural thing there that is, again, not that different from other people who are similarly situated. But Rancho Libertarianism is a great concept that I think that Gustavo Arellano came up with, that really I think describes a certain sense of, it's not even ideology, it's more better to say sensibility. And that sensibility is, even if it's people who live in big cities, there's a rural tinge to it. And I think that's one thing that particularly, say, in a place like, and I always go back to Texas because that's where I'm from. I live in Houston, Texas, but I grew up in a smaller city. And I think the amount of people who are in the big cities of Texas, who are just one or two generations from certainly a small town, much less even a ranch, is pretty high, higher than I think in California and other places. So again, there is a certain, rural sensibility that I think is there, that feeds a certain type of, again, Rancho Libertarianism, a type of conservatism. It didn't necessarily mean that one voted Republican. In fact, it meant quite the opposite for a whole big period of American history. But right now, it's definitely moving people. And I don't want to overstate it. I mean, Latino vote is still predominantly Democratic. But the thing is, if so much of that assumption from stuff like the emerging Democratic majority thesis from earlier in the 2000s is this idea that you could have you would have overwhelming Hispanic support for the Democrats. The Republicans in Texas were able to maintain a working majority, and did with people like George W. Bush and such, with 40% of the Latino vote. You don't need a majority. You just need a big enough plurality to where you can. That's enough to kind of get you certainly over the hurdle. When you got tied in with other ethnic groups, but also just, to me, it affects the tenor of politics. I mean, and I think, I see it, and I just kind of cringe when I see people talk about, I'm actually maybe agreeing with people on the ideological points or issues, but when they talk about, well, the Republicans are going to be just, the anti-Latino party and things like that. Well, I might agree with that. Certainly, some of Trump's comments about, who would come across the border, and, Judge Curiel and these various things that he mentioned. But, it's kind of hard to say and be credible that a party is anti a particular group when millions of people in that group are voting for it. I mean, if at that point, what are you going to start throwing out? False consciousness as an idea. I mean, that's that's a buzzword that basically to me is at best a cop out or a cope. If not if not something even worse. So.
Yeah, I get, maybe to hone in on that, because you talked about Trump, because we were shocked when the Rio Grande Valley had such good numbers for Trump. We also saw that around Miami, parts of Florida, Latino voters more for Trump than what they probably thought. Is the sensibility you talk about more of that? Is that why they can take somebody like Trump, who on its surface should be offensive to certain groups, but they just kind of laugh it off? You talked about the sensibility of the group. Maybe that's a better way to approach when we're talking about a subgroup of a subgroup, which we're talking about with like Rancho Libertarianism, Latinos in specific areas. That sensibility is probably going to be a better way to approach this than just straight political or partisan divides, isn't it?
Yeah, that's definitely going to be part of it. I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into it. I mean, there is this laugh it off factor of just like, he's just this guy who just blows off steam and kind of blusters, and hey, I'm kind of like that, or I know people like that. It's sort of, yeah, and I think so. That's that too, and there you can say part maybe cultural too, particularly. I mean, I think you have more of a sensibility and way of speaking, maybe in more kind of educated upper middle class circles, professional circles, that one doesn't speak a certain way, while in other places, no, it's perfectly fine to speak that way. And Trump tapped into that. Then there's purely kind of more, again, the material or demographic factors, like say in the Rio Grande Valley, where particularly in the more rural counties, Star and Zapata, those are the two that that people honed in on, and people honed in on them because when you have, I think part of it's also the fact that when you don't have really good exit polling, you start looking for other proxies. So when you have a county that's like 90% or 95% Hispanic, you can say, well, how that county voted is tells you something about at least a certain subset of Hispanic vote. It's safe to say that. And so, like in those counties, you also had the fact that a lot of people work for the Border Patrol. They are, and so you have the ripple effect, like say the spouses and friends, and also the people working in the oil industry, working on rigs and that sort of thing. But you go back to the surprise, and I mean, that's the thing. It's like, I'm definitely, I mean, if you look at my Twitter feed, I'm not a Trump fan in any way, shape, or form, and I'm extremely, not a Trump person. But there was a lot who still saw that they were okay with what he was saying, and even with respect to the issue of immigration itself. There's people say, well, let's draw a line between illegal immigration and legal immigration, and there's certainly some people right now on the right who don't necessarily want to make that line, but there's a lot who who still do and still will, and so people say, hey, I came here legally, or my family did. I promise it. Or even if they're not so worried about the illegality issue per se, they're worried about crime, and just and I can say, I mean, I still have family down there. Still, we still have a little family ranch down that area and stuff like that. And it's statistically, it's a very safe area. Your chances of getting mugged or harmed when you're walking through Rio Grande City or Brownsville are a heck of a lot less than if you're walking through a lot of parts of Houston and Dallas. I can tell you that much. But the thing is, there's still this feeling that there is this danger across the border, and it's a very real one. I mean, not so much even the people crossing who are involved with, no one's terribly frightened about the people who are crossing to come work, but there is the cartels across the border, and that's real. And it's denial to say that it's no big deal there. No, there's been a terrible amount of violence there, and people who used to go across the border on a regular basis just don't do it as much anymore. And that's created a real, and I think that's maybe created more of a feeling from people there of just like, no, I mean, I really identify with the north side of that river. And I want to be, I want to, there's certain things on the south side I really want to keep away. And it's not because of racism, and it's not because of some false consciousness of, oh, and that's something that bugs the hell out of me when I hear talk about speak like, oh, well, you're identifying with, with the Anglos, or identify. Like, look, I mean, there may be some people who are that falls in that category, but I mean, most people, I mean, when you see the friend of mine went down and did kind of talk to people at like Trump rallies, like the ones where they do the trucks, the big kind of those big kind of ones where they're driving stuff. And she went to South Texas and interviewed people there. And she was just saying the thing that was striking was, was number one, these people are having fun. It was fun. She said it was impossible to go there and not smile. It's like, okay, I may not agree with the politics here, but yeah, but this is not a people who are a grim group of people, and they were not, and they were Mexican American. They were not. They were, however you want to define that, the food, the music, the sensibility, the language in some cases, they were not there because they were trying to act like, some group that they were not. They were who they were, but that also meant that they were supporting someone who you would think they wouldn't. And the fact is, the numbers are there. I mean, it's just like you saw the drift. And not only in places like South Texas, but places where they're able to do some more, again, that proxy kind of granular kind of analysis. I mean, my understanding is like in Houston and Dallas, that in the precincts that are predominantly Latino, that there was a shift towards Trump. Again, was it a majority? No, but it was but it's like when you and to me, there's a real warning there for the Democrats, and is if in 2020, the year where if it's like if the drift was able to go there in a year where you would think there'd be so much kind of headwind against that because of because of Trump's policies, or what you thought how you thought people reply to them or respond to them, that didn't happen. And boy, if that's the case, Tim, what about in the future, if you had maybe someone like a DeSantis or someone like that, where that baggage wouldn't really be there? That's an issue. And I would say, my fellow Democrats, you've got a problem.
Yeah. Mark Yzaguirre, great stuff. As always, the moral of the story is the national headline doesn't meet the local knowledge. So always dig into these stories a little bit. Great stuff, buddy. Let folks know where they can find you on social media and elsewhere. You've done a lot of writing in the past. We hope you do it in the future. We're always happy to have you at Ordinary Times anytime you get the itch to do so. Let
Absolutely.
Folks know where they can find you, my friend.
Sure. You can find me on best places on Twitter, just Mark, MARK, YZAGUIRRE, no dots or anything else, just there. One of the benefits of having a very unique last name is easy to Google to see for articles and that sort of thing. The piece at Ordinary Times, MAGA in the RGV was what it was called. And, people want to look that up. It kind of went to the detail of what we talked about here today. And I did other stuff in the past, Huffington Post. Also, I started actually writing at a place called From Forum that was kind of led by David Frum, and back over a decade ago. And I've just been to various places, and yeah, feel free to follow on social media and to look at the articles.
Yeah, and we hope we get him in Ordinary Times anytime he wants it. It's an open invitation, my friend. Good
Absolutely.
in-depth stuff on something that gets glossed over way too often, and we greatly appreciate it. It's what we try to do here on Heard Tell. Thank you for your time, sir. I appreciate you.
Thank you.